tax expert Jashwin Baijoo about the issue around a proposed wealth tax. And this has come up once again at the ANC's National Policy Conference, which was, as we all know, held in Joburg over the past weekend. Certain members of the ruling party continue to favor some form of wealth tax to fund a basic income grant. A very good morning to you, Jashwin. Welcome to the program. Does that then suggest that the wealthy or the super rich are not being taxed currently, or are they being taxed at a very marginal rate?
Good morning, Julianne, and thank you for having me. So, all that this means is the super wealthy, as people like to refer to them as, they're being taxed the same as the rest of us. They're being taxed at the upper echelon of the bracket system, which is at 45%. And what this wealth tax seeks to do is to then impose a further tax. And the reason for this, and I mean, as was mentioned at the conference this past weekend by the committee chair herself, is that the majority of the wealth in this country is in the hands of 5% of the population. And that's not right. We'll have to have SARS look into a wealth tax. The wealth tax is not necessarily to say the wealthy are not being taxed. It is to then impose a further tax on the wealthy.
So, Jashwin, my thinking is they can afford it, for goodness sake, they can afford it. Was there a number that was perhaps suggested? I'm thinking the super rich could possibly afford paying another 5 or 10 or even 15% above their 45%, because we do know our tax base is very, very small. This very minute tax base is physically or basically running the rest of the country.
Yeah, correct. So, I mean, I could give you stats. I've been looking into this proposed wealth tax for a while now. I mean, you and I have spoken about it previously as well. And statistically speaking, yes, there is empirical evidence that the Davis Committee found in March of 2018. And just prior to that, this was when the topic was raised at a prior conference where it was then made moot in 2017. Current stats, there's been a couple of studies conducted, the most recent one by the University of Witwatersrand. They've speculated that a wealth tax being imposed on only the richest 354,000 South Africans could raise at least 143 billion in additional revenue. Right now, you must remember though that this is only about 29% of the 500 billion that's required to actually fund this basic income grant, which means, yes, it is a sizable portion. It does sound like a massive number out of context, but there is then the flip side of it. I mean, Julia, if I were to tell you from tomorrow you will pay an additional 15% on your income, would you not then consider immigration to somewhere with a more favorable tax system?
Well, obviously, that's what the experts are saying. They are suggesting that if the wealth tax does go ahead, as was suggested by Mamaloko Kubai, the party's head of economic transformation, that people are going to start immigrating. However, what we are also saying is, we just need to look at the flip side of this conversation is if you fall in the super rich bracket, it goes back to my opening statement. Surely another 5, 10, or even 15% is not going to hurt you. But obviously, if we are now suggesting that the super rich will not buy into that and they'd rather emigrate, would that then suggest that that tax burden is going to be carried by the mid-income band, by people like yourself, myself, and a whole host of others, which is also a very small band, is it not?
Yeah, look, so with that borne in mind, if we look at the findings of the Davis report specifically notes that even though a wealth tax may be for the greater good, the implementation must follow a staged and calculated, purposive approach to promote retention of contributing taxpayers and stem the flow of immigration in favor of a more digestible taxation. Now, what this means is even though there is empirical evidence confirming South Africa has a wealth inequality higher than even the global wealth inequality. And
Wow.
this is when you're talking about countries like Ethiopia and Somalia. So yes, our wealth inequality, as in the differential between your upper echelon and your bottom tier, is drastic, 100%. But a wealth tax is just one tool amongst many that can be used to bridge this gap. And another one is, and has been suggested by the Davis Tax Committee, is actually land reform. But that again is another very contentious topic. And not on any of these fronts, you can't just say today, okay, it's going to be implemented, and tomorrow it is implemented. South Africans will not take well to that. And I do hear your point on, you know what, if you're super wealthy, if that top 5% decide, you know what, we're going to pack up, we're going to immigrate, or even if they start actually purchasing or moving assets offshore, which we have seen a massive uptick on in the last year and a half, 2 years, as well as immigration. I mean, our financial immigration department is doing very well right now. And that is because there are a large number of South Africans that are heading out. But on the flip side, what we also see is a large volume of foreign direct investment coming in, not just to South Africa, but to Africa as a whole, with South Africa being the stepping stone into the rest of Africa. When we talk about wealth tax, all studies and all considerations are based on individual taxpayers. They have not taken into consideration the corporate taxpayer, the multinational taxpayer, or the offshore investors that have now invested into the country or the continent as a whole. And there is some wealth there to be spread. But the adverse consequences of saying, let us impose this wealth tax on these 354,000 individuals will result in things like capital migration or disincentives to save, knock-on impacts on entrepreneurs, up and coming, these young budding entrepreneurs saying, you know what, I'd rather start my business somewhere with a sustainable tax system rather than somewhere where if I make it big and I'm successful, I basically have a punitive tax then imposed on me. That will then have a knock-on impact on the unemployment rate, because with your entrepreneurs leaving, let's say each entrepreneur is between 10 and 100 jobs as a startup. Those are now 10 to 100 unemployed people because a wealth tax has been imposed, diminishing the already shrinking South African tax base even further.
Okay, Intellidex has said that one of the major problems with the wealth tax is that because so few people fall in the super rich category, it would need to be set at a very high rate to raise the required revenue for some sort of significant input. And that is something you've indicated earlier on. And then also the other issue is you spoke about land reform. How would that look like? How could that ever become feasible and equitable?
So, with regards to, let's just touch on Intellidex firstly, right? So, the Intellidex finding, the most recent report at least, the finding there was supported by the Bureau of Economic Research, as well as a number of independent economists, very clearly stating that if the pool is so small, the rate must be high. And I think that was pretty evident when they spoke initially on just your top 5%, your high net worth, your very wealthy individuals, but just your top 5%, right? So aside from that, I mean, if we were to then venture into the topic of land reform, and at a very high level, because to fully discuss this topic, we'd probably need about an hour or two. But very basically, what the Davis Tax Committee has found is that something like land reform, or an additional land tax, so to speak, is a bit more feasible than a wealth tax. And the reason being is, even if the land is not being economically realized from a rental perspective, in terms of being fully utilized to generate revenue for the landowner, it is still easily determinable where that taxing obligation sits, simply because all land is held by virtue of a title deed. And that makes it easier to actually determine where your taxing obligation sits, and a lot harder for the owner of that land to say, you know what, it's not me. I mean, you can physically find the owner of that land.
Okay, Julius Malema has been, flying this flag very, very high. And when we look land reform, you've given us the backstory to that. What does that say to the man in the street? When we're talking land reform, are we also saying that people owning large swathes of land would have to give up
No,
some of their land?
no,
Are
we are
we,
not saying,
all right,
expropriation without compensation. We are definitely
okay,
not saying that. We
all
are
right.
saying the implementation of an additional tax to be levied on people, as you say, who own these large plots of land. In no shape or form does the Davis Tax Committee say, listen, let's subdivide and expropriate without compensation.
All right, Jashwin, let's still on the land issue. Obviously, when we talk the land issue, there's also rural land and obviously urban land. And we know that we're having major overcrowding in all the large metropoles, and we're seeing unbelievable shack dwellings springing up all over. Will that be addressed by the land issue, be it expropriation or however else government needs to or wants to go ahead with this issue, or taxes for that matter?
Well, I don't see how there's a correlation between a tax being imposed on, say, a farmer that owns 20 plots of land, right? And the shack dwelling of 100 square meters that holds 100 people. So there's no direct correlation there. Yes, taxes, additional taxes will increase contribution to the fiscus, which means there is more money available for your basic income grants and certain others, housing subsidies, or whatever the case may be. But that's not a direct correlation to say if farmer A has 20 pieces of land, and next to his 20 pieces of land, there's a single piece of land with 100 people, that those 100 people should now filter into his 20 pieces of land just for the sake of overcrowding. That is by no means the objective of either the Davis Tax Committee's findings, nor any discussion surrounding wealth tax or possible land tax. It's
And
simply
not
to
even land
generate additional revenue to the
expropriation.
fiscus. Yeah, the expropriation, we haven't heard much recently. I do take your point that it was a flag that was previously flown quite high, and there was a massive uproar. But to venture into that realm, even for the political powers that be, it's a very slippery slope. You must remember that there are constitutional rights. These are enshrined in the democracy of our country. And ultimately, if you want to start expropriating without compensation, you want to basically be Robin Hood. You want to take from the rich and give to the poor, which we understand. It's an admirable mindset, but that's not the way to do it.
Okay, my final question then. There's a lot of noise about land tax, the ANC probably, or the issue around wealth tax, and the ANC may just forge ahead with it. If that does become some form of possibility, how soon do you think it would be introduced? Undoubtedly, lots of work would need to go into it. Draw up the proper plans, the white paper, all the different papers, etc., before it is actually introduced. What length of time are we looking at?
Yeah, look, so we must bear in mind that it was tabled in 2017. The point was mooted. It's not feasible. The findings in 2018 by the Davis Tax Committee are that if you want to implement it, you implement it in such a planned and structured way that ultimately it needs to be sustainable in the long run. So if they are to follow the guidance provided by the Davis Tax Committee, in the in the chance that it's actually going to happen, the idea of wealth tax, it's to adjust the financial inequalities in South Africa. And as we know, it's human nature to do what's best for oneself. And that includes protecting their hard earned money against a tax which can be construed almost as punitive in nature.
Mhm.
So, step one is to tweak the bracket system to actually say, you know what, it now caters for this wealth tax. You must then also clearly define qualifying criteria. You cannot just say the top 5%. You need to put values on assets, annual income, if there's legacy money, possibly immovable property valuations, a number of pieces of land held, the extent to which the earths may be cumulatively, something like that. You need to have qualifying criteria when you want to tackle something like this. And that needs to form a staged approach. And as you rightfully said, it's got to be a white paper. Before that, there's got to be a circular discussion. It's got to be released for public comment. So it's not something that's going to happen in the next year. Probably
Okay,
not even.
so no need to panic right now. And you are so right, Josh, when you did indicate that when you and I get together, we need possibly an hour to go through
Uh-huh.
what we need to discuss. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you indeed for your expertise on this matter. Till the next time, we can breathe easily now. Not that we fall into that high income bracket, but I mean, people could breathe easily for a little while longer.
Just do bear in mind as a parting remark that if it does become more than just a rumor and a topic tabled, the time between finalizing all of those roundtable discussions, the white papers, and the public comment will give the high net worth individuals and that so-called top 5% enough time to wrap up their financial affairs and
Oh,
immigrate.
absolutely. They're starting already. Jashwin Baijoo, wonderful talking with you. Till the next time. God bless.